As the nation reels from an explosion of chaotic anti-Jewish protests spreading across college campuses, including right here in Virginia, this week we examine the question of how in the world did we get here and what can we do about it? Plus, the woke crowd is now trying to claim weather seasons as gender identities. That's right, as in summer and fall. We'll explain more. Welcome to Speak Up Virginia, equipping you to speak up on the life, family, and freedom issues that matter most to you. From the Family Foundation, I'm your host, Candi Cushman, with our president, Victoria Cobb. Well, hello, everyone. Before we get into today's episode, I did want to bring you up to speed on some late breaking news. You know, we've been seeing these just chaotic protests breaking out all across Virginia's campuses, and it really is very disturbing. And we talk about that in today's episode. We go into why is it happening? What can we do about it? But something happened right after we taped this, and we wanted to just go ahead and add on the latest news on that because it really is very disturbing. And specifically, we wanted to touch on what is happening at the heart of VCU, what was happening right as we went into this. And you see these very disturbing images of students clashing with police in the heart of VCU campus, that's Virginia Commonwealth University. And this is all happening just as students are heading into exam week. And then, of course, we also have students getting arrested or have been arrested at Virginia Tech, at Mary Washington, and now there's rumblings of possibly another protest at Christopher Newport University, and that may have already happened by the time you hear this. So it is just very disturbing. It seems like there's a lot of copycatting going on with students jumping from one campus to the other. Now it's really hitting Virginia in a hard way. And I'm just going to show you some excerpts, albeit, again, very disturbing images. It just kind of breaks your heart to see it, both for the students, I think, and the police and everybody caught up in this. But we're going to show you some video clips of the protest at VCU. And as you will see, we've now become international news with this. So let's just watch this real quick. Well, clearly, Victoria, this problem is spreading. You know, even as we speak, it seems to just be escalating across the nation.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note in the case of VCU that they did their best to peacefully clear the protesters, to prevent it from getting out of hand and really disrupting those you mentioned. We're going into exam week, they're scheduling tests and all these things. So VCU put out a statement saying that they gave the protesters plenty of sort of warning to kind of get up and leave, but their encampment violated a bunch of policies, including prohibitions against trespassing on campus at property late at night, which VCU is not an area you should be hanging out late at night anyway. But all that to say, so basically the protesters wouldn't move, and so they chose to respond instead of just picking up and abiding by the policies. They decided to respond with disrespect and claiming that, that they had a right to be there and actually throwing projectiles at the police, which then, of course, meant that riot gear is going to be used and it's going to end up escalating. And that's basically what went down. And I like the way the governor has stepped in and issued, the way he put it. Basically, he's saying, look, we need to protect free expression. I think everybody's sympathetic to the idea that college campuses are going to have people that are freely expressing ideas, but it's different when it crosses the line. And I think this is kind of how the governor put it. quote, intimidating Jewish students and preventing them from attending classes and using annihilation speech to express deeply anti-Semitic views. Like he's saying that part is a problem. And honestly, the Speaker of the House also put out a statement, and he did an excellent job his statement started by outlining October 7th and what actually happened with the rape and pillage and everything that went down. Basically, like, this is what we're talking about. And the Speaker of the House makes the point, we're not having people say there should be a ceasefire. And they're not talking about both sides. They're not saying return the hostages. They're only speaking against the Israel and what they're doing. And they're being very specific about being anti-Semitic in their wording. And so I think we've got government officials stepping in and trying to say, look, this is not an acceptable way to protest. And I think that's the important part.
And VCU pointed out itself in its statement that a lot of these people aren't even students.
Yeah, that's important also. This is not all just kids or even, and we've seen professors get arrested. This is not all just kids and professors.
Yeah. And then it's ridiculous the argument that they should be allowed to have an encampment. I mean, some people might remember the Chaz encampment in Seattle, and you can't just have a place where police can't come in and there's just whatever happens, violence. That's not realistic for a campus. So let's just put that in perspective.
I don't really understand. If you're trying to make a statement, and you could come back day after day in a confined, appropriate area of space. But this idea that you're trying to disrupt, I mean, that's the problem, is like it's intending to create havoc, to mess everything up, to be the loudest, most aggressive sort of statement you can make. That's where it crosses the line. Have a robust debate. I think we've talked about this. But anyway, all that to say, the problem with the statements from the universities and the university efforts here, and I'm not picking on one university, but the problem is it's a little too late. And we're going to talk about that in the show a little bit, that this is the Marxist ideology coming home to roost.
Yeah. It's great they're doing kind of a strong stance now, but to your
point,
you created this.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think the bottom line is, as you watch today and you hear us diving into more why this is happening now, let's remember to pray for just the angst that is on campus right now, because it is difficult for everybody to navigate this. I mean, I do think about those police trying to walk a line here, keep control, keep things from getting out of line. And the students that are just caught up in this and don't even the time know what they're talking about. Yeah,
exactly.
The professors and our governor are trying to navigate all this turmoil. So let's be praying for that. And without further ado, we bring you today's show. Well, welcome back, everyone. Great to have you with us on Speak Up Virginia. Before we dive right into some of our more sobering topics today, I did want to throw one thing out, Victoria. With all the chaos going on in the world, it can be a little hard to fall asleep sometimes with your mind churning. And sometimes, if you're like me, you might put on an audiobook to help you go to sleep. Well, I just discovered that because of AI, you can now have Jimmy Stewart read you to sleep.
Well, what concerns me a little bit is that he's not here anymore, and we're using his voice in many different words that he never said. I don't really love the idea that AI can do that, to be honest with you, even though that might be a nice use of AI.
Apparently, whoever controls Jimmy Stewart's voice, I'm not really sure who that is, has given permission, and there's an app now. They provide books to, help you go to sleep.
Does his family get royalties from this? I just kind of feel like you're using the guy. I mean, whatever happened to selecting, you can select good audiobooks based on who's reading them. So, for example, one of my favorite books is a YouTube, written by Bono, and he reads it. And his voice is lovely, and the book is great. Why don't we just do that? I feel like that is more acceptable than...
I just can't complain about the opportunity to have Jimmy Stewart read me to sleep. I am tempted to get...
You're totally going to do it. You're totally going to do it. You have to tell us how it goes.
Okay, but if you could just pick one person in the past to read you to sleep.
In the past?
If you're going to give in on the whole AI thing.
I don't know.
What about C.S. Lewis? I don't know how soothing his voice is.
I feel like I can't sleep to him because he makes me think. I don't know what he would say. He would not have a bedtime story that is simple enough for me to just rest my mind, because everything I read from him, I'm thinking about what he's really meaning and what's behind the characters and all of that. So I don't know. I don't think I have. I'm sorry. I struggle. I think, you know why? Because you worry when you're in politics that when you can change someone's voice and you can use it to say whatever, especially when they're not alive, I just worry what that's going to do to opposition ads and all of that. And so all I can see is danger, danger, danger. I can't even
They're not going to sleep to our voices because we give them too much to worry about. So that's not an issue. But anyway.
Yeah, no one sleeps to the podcast if we're talking about serious issues.
Well, speaking of that, let's dive right into the chaos. And I thought we should talk about the turmoil, the very disturbing scenes that we are seeing coming out of college campuses all across the nation. We're seeing this, the protests. Some have even had violent incidents happening. It's just so disturbing. And I will even mention, it's clearly anti-Semitic, anti-Israel. We've got chants coming out pretty much openly, especially at Columbia, saying, let's burn Tel Aviv to the ground. Go Hamas, we love you and we support your rockets too. I mean, it's just atrocious. And I'm just going to put a map on the screen showing you how these protests are spreading across the country. You will see UVA listed, the college right here in Virginia. So we're not exempt here in Virginia. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But how are you processing some of this, Victoria, just watching this kind of spread around?
Well, I am disturbed that they're sort of described as pro-Palestine, and they're clearly not just that, right? Like as you're saying, some of the actual quotes are way beyond that. They're anti-Semitic. And the violence. I mean, and you're hearing you can hear some folks saying, well, these are, important, like college campuses are the places where free ideas get exchanged. But this isn't the way to exchange them. I just always think, why, even if there are, I'll say differing views on the war, which is hard to even stomach given what happened on October 7th. But even if this protest thing is just totally unacceptable. So I think maybe to give some context.
Let me just say something when you bring up free speech.
Yeah.
Okay, where were they with free speech when they were censoring all these people because of so-called microaggressions, and all of a sudden we're all about free speech?
Yeah.
But before,
you can't have it both ways. You're absolutely right.
Like they're tearing abortion crosses, little white crosses, showing sorrow over abortions. Those get torn out of the ground and it's fine. I mean, I don't know. I don't see why all of a sudden it's about free speech.
No, you're absolutely right. Free speech has been correctly allowing speech without ridiculous behavior has been a challenge at colleges universally, and we see in the pro-life movement. I mean, we talked about it here, where you send in a conservative or pro-life speaker, and it's like a riot takes place to get them
or posters
to not
are ripped
be able
off
to.
the
Right.
ground.
I mean, it's just ridiculous. So you're absolutely right. I think we should give people some context. So I think we should watch a clip. CBN does a good job of just kind of giving you a little background about what these actually look like. So let's take a look at that, and then we can chat about it.
Police arrested dozens of protesters at Yale, while Columbia University canceled in-person classes. CBN News Washington correspondent Abigail Robertson brings us more.
On Columbia's campus, Jewish students endured threats with calls to go back to Poland. Here, a demonstrator points at pro-Israel students while holding a sign that reads, "Al-Qassam's next targets." And a Jewish professor is denied entry to the campus while school officials look on.
I am a professor here. I have every right to be everywhere on campus. You cannot let people that support Hamas on campus and me, a professor, not go on campus. Let me in now.
Meanwhile, other Columbia faculty members join protesters chanting "Free Palestine" and calling for the school to divest from companies selling weapons to Israel. Demonstrations growing more radical have Jewish students fearing for their safety, leading one rabbi to tell students to stay away because the school can't protect them.
I was there today, and it made me sick hearing the things they were saying and doing. So over this holiday, I kind of just want to try to avoid it as best as I can for my own safety.
And just to add on to that clip, we've been seeing these heartbreaking testimonies coming from Jewish students on campuses. I mean, there was the student at Yale who was stabbed in the eye, basically, and had to go to the hospital. Someone stabbed her in the eye with a flagpole, end of a flagpole. Then there was the student at Columbia who had rocks thrown in his face. So it's definitely crossing the line, into something worse. We're seeing that happening.
Well, and I also think the professor, I don't know if you saw that, but the professor that was a Jewish professor, that they basically said, we can't let you on campus because we can't keep you safe. But yet they're allowing these protests that clearly have enough violence that they can't have somebody, there's enough hate that you're having to protect the group they're protesting against. That tells you everything you need to know. Well, and you've got USC having to cancel graduation. When you really get to the point where you're canceling graduation, and remember, this is the poor class. I just have to note this. This is the class that had their high school graduations canceled by COVID. And now that group is going to have their college graduation canceled because of these protests. I mean, that's devastating.
And Columbia canceling classes in person.
Yes, now they're going virtual.
that is definitely appeasement at its worst, in its worst form, just to put it mildly.
All I know is they're paying. So I'm sorry, as a parent looking at a kid going to college, looking at these tuitions, they're paying so much money for that education that they're now going to have to get purely online because people can't control themselves.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about what's going on right here in UVA. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, there have been these protests going on at UVA for a little while. We've talked about them here before, but basically you might remember that horrific statement that was made by the Students for Justice in Palestine. They're students at UVA, and they were basically praising the, quote, resistance fighters in Gaza right after the terrible attack in Israel. And so in addition to the Students for Justice in Palestine, there have also been protests at UVA sponsored by campus chapters of the Young Democratic Socialists of America and the Queer Student Union.
Okay, that one I don't really understand.
Yeah, I got to lay it out there. It doesn't seem like there should be alignment between traditionally Muslim type groups and queer LGBT type groups because that faith does not abide that lifestyle. So I'd
really like to see them go and try to go to, with Hamas with their
go have a
queer
pride
students
parade.
banner.
Go have a pride parade in front of Hamas and see what happens. I cannot imagine that's going to go over well. So yeah, and I mean it is ridiculous. And then we have to mention this die-in that just happened.
Most recent,
this is the most recent thing where they basically had a die-in.
I have seen some commentators kind of pulling together the reason these groups are all allied in these protests is because it's pulling together anti-Western thought, a kind of deconstruction.
Yeah, that is the connecting point. I think that is the connecting point.
Yeah, so I know I'm trying to put this all together in my mind and context historically, and I know some people are saying, okay, we're just going back to the Vietnam protests, but to me it seems like it's worse, right? Because we didn't have students attacking each other in the Vietnam protests, right?
I mean, I think the difference is it was sort of and I don't pretend to be a historian, so I don't want to be, too simplistic about what happened then. But I think the difference is you had anti-war sentiment, but it didn't come across, it wasn't at a people group. And I think that is where we've got a problem, is we've crossed from anti-war sentiment to hatred towards individuals that are all around them in their college campuses. And so I think that's the concern. I certainly listen to, NPR puts on the professor at Columbia that, was at Columbia as a student when the Vietnam protests were happening, and now they're a professor, and they're saying that was the Vietnam protest was like the pride of their life, and they're describing these protests as just peaceful, basically, as if these students just want speech and they shouldn't be suppressed. And, you get that slant from some of the media, but I don't think it's the same. And also, it's just interesting. I mean, Vietnam, the United States was fully engaged. That was a war we were fully engaged in. This is, an allied country. It is different to me in a big way. I mean,
well, to your point about pitting groups of people together or against each other, it goes into the fact that they've been preaching this kind of Marxism, radical ideology for, I don't know, at least a couple of decades now. So aren't we kind of seeing those chickens come home to roost, so to speak?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that this is the outgrowth of what has been taught in college campuses. And I think you can see that best at where it's happening. Schools that would rate the most liberal or the most sort of teaching the most Marxist concepts are the ones that you're seeing the protests at, right? Like, so you can literally see it's an outgrowth. Schools that are known, even I'm talking public schools across the board, not necessarily public or not Christian schools, but even the schools that are ranked more conservatively, just generally, aren't the ones where you're seeing these protests.
These protests are not happening there.
Correct. So you're literally seeing, like, you can connect the ideology to the protests.
Yeah. Tell us about how we've seen DEI. What is it? Diversity, equity, and inclusion as the next evolution of this Marxist stuff. Tell us how is that connected to what we're seeing right now?
Well, I don't think it's a coincidence that, we talked about this before, but like UVA spending $20 million on DEI programs. And so they should be the most inclusive. They should be the most understanding of $20 million. Those students per student should be like the kindest, most tolerant people if that's what DEI is about. And yet we're seeing protests at UVA. And I think there is a connection. I think it's actually DEI programs are actually creating this notion that we're all in these categories and we're all pitted against each other, and it's really tragic.
So it is different than a bunch of students unifying together to protest a war. We are pitting groups against each other.
That's how I
this
see
is
it.
The outgrowth. I do want to point out, as far back as 2021, Heritage Foundation did this really interesting study documenting how an overwhelming number of DEI staff at universities were on social media spewing this anti-Semitic, views, if you want to be kind about it. They're spewing anti-Semitic views all over social media. There's a little chart we're putting up here on the screen. For some mysterious reason, they don't seem too concerned about China and the atrocities that happen in China. It's definitely all targeted at Israel. But I want to hear your thoughts on the irony of that. You kind of alluded to it already, but
I just think DEI programs are not about diversity, equity, inclusion of all races. They have always been focused on one or two minorities to the exclusion of other groups, right? They just aren't actually. We saw that even in the merit stuff up in Northern Virginia, where it's like, in the name of equity, we're actually going to harm Asian Americans because they happen to be the ones that were excelling academically.
Right.
So DEI programs have just never been about actual inclusion and tolerance for all.
Okay, I know Family Foundation has been trying to address this. Tell us about those efforts.
Yeah, it feels like there's just this great divide, and we felt like, there's a place to step in, and so we helped create and introduce a resolution that expressed support for the state of Israel and condemned Hamas. That seems pretty basic to us. Look, they came in, they had an attack. Let's support Israel and say we don't believe in terrorism, and that seemed obvious. But Democrats actually refused to let it out of committee, so they wouldn't vote on it.
This was in the General Assembly that just happened.
Yeah, this is just this past session, and they wouldn't take a vote on it. They literally avoided a vote. And then there was a bill that made sure that our tax-funded public universities and colleges didn't have a DEI program that in any way promoted anti-Semitism. So again, that's even more clear. Like, we're saying you can have a DEI program, but you can't have one that in any way promotes this. And even that one got left in committee. They didn't want to vote on it. So they're avoiding these things. And there was a budget amendment that tried to do the same thing. So there were like 3 attempts to say we aren't in favor of any kind of hate towards the Jewish people. And they dodged them all.
So talk to us about that. It is the Democratic Party blocking all 3
They were in
of
leadership.
these.
They have the majority on all the committees. They had the opportunity to move any of these forward.
So I find that really interesting because you've got these prominent Democrat leaders, whether it's at the national level like Chuck Schumer or here in Virginia, Filler Corn.
Yeah.
She's been out there saying that, when Iran attacked Israel, she was out there saying we need to stand with our ally Israel, which I agree with. But then you've got another Democrat out there, Sam Razul, openly siding with students making anti-Israel statements. We're just going to put his post on X up here. To that point we were making about this being an attack on Western civilization, because he says he's blaming the, quote, systems for the, quote, genocide in Gaza. So I think those systems are kind of getting back to the whole DEI philosophy. But what's going on here it's confusing, I think, with Democrats that are saying we need to side with Israel, and then you got Democrats siding with students, on the college campuses making these atrocious statements.
I think the Democrat Party has a huge problem on its hands. I think they have a segment of their base that they are trying to appease that disdains Israel. I think it's that simple. They just, and this is just a huge dilemma for them politically. This is going to be a problem for President Biden as he runs for re-election. What is his support of Israel? Because their party is not on the same page.
All right. Well, I hope that there would be some awakening also among the Jewish community about, conservatives and how we respect the Judeo-Christian heritage. But with that said, where do we go from here, Victoria? I know Speaker Mike Johnson has been out there talking about how maybe we should consider defunding colleges that can't control chaos and protect their own students. They shouldn't get taxpayer money. Where do we go from here? Because we've already tried to address this in Virginia. Now what?
Yeah, this is the thing. They're, these college and universities, first of all, they're getting a bunch of federal money. Second of all, people are paying huge tuitions to send their kids there. They expect to send them in safety and not into the middle of a protest that gets out of hand. And so, yes, I think the question is, do political leaders look at this and try to start setting some parameters on what is free speech, what is appropriate free speech, and what is the moment that it gets beyond? Because I don't think that's clear, because it is not applied evenly across the board.
If they were teaching the U.S. Constitution and not DEI, they might understand what free speech is.
Well, I think that is what, Speaker Johnson's trying to get back to, is like, we got to look at what roots are we stirring up? What are we putting into the minds of young people that it then comes out this way?
But it's been decades. What do we do now?
I think we really have to consider that money is the thing that makes change. I hate to say it, but the reason he's talking about funding is because that is the threat that actually makes a difference. I mean, simply saying you got to get your act together just doesn't seem to work, because if you look at these polls of some of these universities and where their professors put their money politically and what they say and where they align themselves, they're so overwhelmingly liberal that to get change on issues, or to get, in the case where we talked about conservatives when they're trying to express free speech, and to get them to appropriately apply free speech just doesn't seem to work with simple, like, hey, let's like admonishment doesn't seem to be enough.
Money and staff change.
Yeah, I think it's right. And you see that a little with Governor DeSantis, putting Ben Sasse in charge of a university.
Yeah, okay.
That's a statement hire. When you hire Ben Sasse to be in charge of a university, you're saying we are going to do things differently, And I think where there are conservative governors and they have appointment powers over their colleges, the boards of visitors, all those things matter. So hopefully Governor Youngkin's been really putting great appointments on our universities, trying to kind of send them back in the right direction. And donors matter. I'm really thrilled to see, the owner of the Patriots say, look, we shouldn't be giving any more money to Columbia, pulling out. When you get the big donors pulling out, that's helpful too.
And our governor changed DEI to, I think it was DEO.
Yes, opportunity. Yes.
Well, you were mentioning to me, this is all very sobering. It can be depressing to look at, but what we don't see in the media are all these wonderful spiritual renewals happening amongst students.
Yeah, I do think we have to give some hope, because some of us parents are sending our kids to college, and it's, you don't want to think of all college as being terrible. So there is some exciting things. I feel like we've been watching, and it's not just Christian universities. We've been watching, because everybody remembers, the big revival. I think the Christians kind of paid attention to the big revival at Ashland, but it's not just there. We're seeing on public secular schools big baptisms happening in their fountains. FSU, Alabama had one, Auburn had one. So there are places where the Spirit is moving, where Christians are obviously sharing the gospel somehow on their college campus because others are being drawn to it. So there are some good things. We just have to find those. And as parents who are thinking about sending kids to college, we got to do a lot of homework, a lot of homework on, there's some great Christian universities would also be good choices. Liberty just had an awesome prayer and worship service. Anyway, there are good things. I don't want to end on totally every college is terrible and all bad things are happening at colleges. That wouldn't be fair.
It was a great contrast, an uplifting contrast while all these protests were happening, to see what was happening on Liberty's campus with prayer and worship. I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's that time again. Time for our Inconceivable Moments Award. This is where we're featuring examples of the absolute lunacy and craziness that happens when cultural leaders try to give guidance completely apart from biblical principles. And we're calling this the Liberals' Most Inconceivable Moments Award.
Inconceivable!
All right, well, before we close out today, I did want to bring up something that is definitely worthy of our Inconceivable Award. And, there's this whole alphabet soup that we're all familiar with now. LGBTQIA. I think there's even a 2 now for Two-Spirit. It just keeps growing because, we have to have so many alternative identity options in our society now. And this is just, a gift that keeps on giving. And apparently we can soon expect another combination of letters to be added to this list, because there's now something out there called gender season. I don't know if that's going to be an S letter or GS or whatever. But there's already a G in there. Well, I'm going down a rabbit hole, so I won't figure out that for them. But apparently this is an entire thing going around the internet, gender season. What's your thoughts, Victoria?
It's hard to even have thoughts because it feels so absurd. It's hard to wrap my brain about. This has been the case with every letter that's been added. You know, when people started talking about furries, I didn't even know what to think of that. I mean, honestly, it would be comical if it weren't so disturbing, I guess, is the only thought I can have.
It's comical until you start thinking about young girls. I think a lot of these are young girls, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, that are actually trying to live this out and what that means for later on when maybe they decide they actually want to have a family and get married. There's going to be lifelong harm if these identities lead to choices. But let's let this video speak for itself. I'm just going to let you hear about the gender season idea.
Did you know, however, there is a gender identity that is linked to the seasons? This is called gender season. And this is a gender identity I've only just learnt about. It's a micro-identity. It's not an identity that I have ever heard discussed before. It's a new one for me. Gender season is an individual who explores their gender identity in relation to a season or all the seasons. So this might be somebody whose gender expression and identity is linked to one season. So for example, winter. Or this might be somebody whose gender identity and expression changes depending on the season.
And just so you know, it looks like we already have designated pronouns for gender season. I'm going to put this up on the screen for our viewers. It looks like pronoun options include summer self, fall self, weather self, sun self, snow self, and so on. I was thinking about weather self. I guess, is that the all-inclusive variety?
Okay, this is insane, but I'm just going to say this. The more weird pronouns they have, the more I hope like the places that are playing the pronoun game realize how ridiculous this is. You know, think about this. There are people who are being forced to use other people's pronouns. So when this weather person, I'm sorry, I don't know what to call.
Weather self.
When this weather self comes into a classroom at a university and they all have to introduce themselves as pronouns and then other people are supposed to refer to this person as weather self. I've got to think this is going to be the thing that tips us back to rationality and sanity, where people go, okay, this pronoun game, this thing we're doing where people get to pretend that there's something other than they're not, and we all have to use that, and people get fired. I mean, Peter Vlaming got fired for not using pronouns. If he had had a student in his class that said, hi,
Snow self.
I'm snow self, I'm summer self, I'm sorry, fall self, I don't know what all these things are, would they have fired him for that?
Well, and what about these people that are forced by their companies to list their pronouns at the end
this
of
is
their
what I'm
email?
wondering.
I mean, so the company's gonna just also have people listing all these seasons.
I almost want to. I mean, again, if there weren't human beings involved and it weren't so tragic, because again, we have to look at the actual person in this video, but. If it weren't that, I'd be thankful to these people because I think they are actually helping drive us back to saying the further we get from this is not reality, and we all know it's not reality, the more we can come back. But unfortunately, there's actual people who I think are so unrooted, so they just don't have, I don't know this girl in this video. I don't know any other people who identify as this, but I will say this. I cannot imagine that their family is everything that you'd hope a family would be, that they have faith. They're just not rooted. They're looking for something. They're searching desperately. I think they're searching desperately for a way to be unique and stand out and have something to claim. I don't know what else to think about it.
It shows us what happens when we become unmoored from, like you're saying, a family system that gives us a foundation. And more than that, even if you look at it from a spiritual perspective, we have a whole generation that doesn't have an identity based in anything eternal outside themselves and temporary things right in front of them. And that is scary and disturbing, and we are seeing the fallout of that. So with that said, I don't really have the heart to give a big humorous inconceivable award today, but I just think it's what you said, Victoria. This is showing the lunacy that does happen when we're trying to find ourselves outside of God's plan, his loving plan. Thanks for joining us, everybody. It was great to have you with us. Please help us get the word out and share this podcast so we can take those first steps toward redeeming our culture so people can start to understand where all this is coming from and how we can start to take a different direction and redeem our culture. We need you to help us do that. Share the podcast. Give us that 5-star review if you're on Apple or Spotify, because that helps us get the word out. And remember, we are stronger when we speak together.